Well, welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast episode, where we're going to take a real high-level look at liability when it comes to aircraft. This is a very broad subject, so we're just going to touch on the basics and go into more detail in future episodes. So liability are those things you become legally obligated for out of the operation of your aircraft to third parties, right? That could include passengers, that include bodily injury to other people on the ground. That could include property damage. That could be other aircraft. It could be to property that the aircraft would impact. But these third-party exposures that you become legally obligated to out of the result of an occurrence, right? A sudden accidental event or a repeated event over time that leads to the bending of metal. An occurrence has to happen that makes you legally liable for bodily injury or property damage to others or bodily injury to your passengers. So you need coverage for that. And typically, most aircraft insurance companies for other than agricultural aviation use write on a combined single limit. So there is one limit of liability for bodily injury, property damage, and passenger legal liability. For many small aircraft with lower time pilots, that limit of liability may be $1 million each occurrence. However, there would be a sublimit or limitation of that $1 million limit. Only passengers are only eligible for $100,000 of that coverage. So $1 million each occurrence, sublimited to $100,000 per passenger. A few carriers may use the term per person. A per person sublimit is less coverage because per person would include people on the ground as well. So be sure to look for that term per passenger versus per person. Now, business jets, you may see limits from 5 or 10 million to 100 and 300 million or up to $500 million. And when you get in the airline, you could be seeing 1 billion to 2 billion plus limits of liability. So when it comes to aviation, liability limits are a high exposure. And so with your liability coverage, you don't only get that liability limit of protection, but you also get a legal defense and an educated legal defense. Your aviation insurers work with very talented and knowledgeable aviation defense attorneys to protect you. And the great news is that legal defense is outside of the limits of liability. So if you have $1 million of coverage and it takes $1 million to defend the lawsuit, those are two separate levels. And the only problem is that the duty to defend your liability loss on the exposure basically expires once the limit of liability is exhausted. So that's the importance of carrying higher limits of liability, is that you do not want your limits to be exhausted. And $100,000 or $1 million runs out pretty quick in the United States with our litigious society and very high jury and judge awards. So carrying adequate limits is key. Again, that's a topic for another time, but limits of liability and then a legal defense are key elements of your aircraft liability policy. Now, you can purchase liability for the aircraft you own and operate, but you can also purchase aircraft that you operate that you do not own or that you lease. So it's important to communicate with your broker the situation, but keep in mind, if you use aircraft in your business or personally that you do not own, you need some non-owned aircraft liability. Again, that's a topic for another episode, but as we're talking about liability, it's important to keep in mind. Well, there's your high altitude look at aircraft liability. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the Aviation Insurance Podcast. If you found this episode of value, please share it with someone who would benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player so you don't miss any new episodes and to help our show have more impact. This episode is brought to you by Aeris Insurance Solutions, your flight plan for navigating the turbulence of aviation insurance. For more information, visit aerisinsurance.com. That is www.aerisinsurance.com. Disclaimer: These episodes are for educational purposes only, and due to the changing regulatory and legal nature of the business, some information may change over time. Having a well-educated and experienced aviation insurance broker on your team is an absolute requirement to success in business and for managing your aircraft and aviation business risks.